So again, welcome everybody to the webinar, Learning Resources Minimal Metadata Application Profile. This online workshop is part of the Decade of Data of the Research Data Alliance. My name is Katarzyna Wiernacka, or short Kati, and I'm happy to be the moderator of this event. It is really nice to see such a huge interest in the topic. What we want to do today is to introduce to you the application profile of the minimal metadata set for learning resources developed by one of the focus groups of the Education and Training on Handling of Research Data interest group of the RDA. We want to show you how they have been implemented in selected catalogs and give you, the participants, the opportunity to discuss the various perspectives, needs, and motivations for implementing such an application profile. I will send you the link to the collaborative notes again and to the slides for those who came in a bit later. So what we want to do today is, after this very short welcome and a following short introduction to the Education and Training on Handling of Research Data interest group, we'll give you some insights on the purpose and the goals for a minimal metadata set. Afterwards, we'll have a look at the process for developing recommendations and on the results of the focus group. In the next step, Nancy, she's by the way the main speaker today, I'll introduce her a little bit later, will present the current work on the metadata application profiles, the lessons learned, and the revised recommendations. By the end of the webinar, as I mentioned, there will be time for your questions and of course for discussions. But before we really go into deep, I want to introduce our interest group to those who maybe don't know us yet. So, who are we? We are a group of 420 people who want to exchange about existing developments, initiatives, and everything around teaching and training of research data management. And we want to create useful solutions like taxonomies, teaching concepts, or, like in this case, metadata sets to increase the findability of learning materials. I am only one of the co-chairs of the group. Laura Molloy, Amy Nürnberger, and Jan Wilbrand are the others, and soon Magdalena Szuflita-Żurawska will join the co-chairs too. And a very important point is we are still looking for other co-chairs representing other regions of the world outside of Europe. So if you are interested in supporting and leading the group with us together, don't hesitate to contact us. I would like to send you some links that you see on the slides already. So there you can find information on the group, our contact details, our outcomes. There it is. So you can check on that. Yeah, and now, before I give over to our wonderful Nancy Hobbelheinrich, who will present to you these outcomes of the focus group on minimal metadata for learning resources, I would like to do a little poll with you. Now I have to check if it works properly. I will send you a link to a Mentimeter that you please follow. Chat, you should have the link now. And I will share my screen to see your answers. Can you see the Mentimeter slides? Yes, perfect. So for those who enter a little bit late, I sent the link to the Mentimeter again, and I will add the links to the collaborative notes and to the slides. I can see that most of you have already some experience in searching and finding learning material. That's great to see. I will wait a little bit longer and send the link maybe again for those who entered a bit late. And there is another question, a follow-up question to this. There is the second question. The second question is, while searching, what were the descriptive properties of the resources you were looking for but didn't find? Oh, thank you, Maggie, for the information in the chat. That's a very important information. Please sign in into the attendee list in the table in the collaborative notes. Thank you very much for that. The answers coming in. So far, the target audience seems to be the biggest one. Okay, I don't see answers coming, but you're allowed still to write down your answers. But I think at this point, I would hand over to Nancy. So the floor is yours.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Yeah, interesting responses here. It looks like when you see the minimal set that we come up with, there a lot of these are covered, but some are not. So it's quite interesting. I love the one about I cannot remember. That one would be hard to code, but the learning topic codes is an interesting idea as well. Hopefully we can find out more about what that means during the discussion part, and the focus on preservation and so on. So these are very helpful, very interesting to see what people couldn't find. So hopefully our minimal set can help some of those. So okay, I will go ahead and get started then. I think, let's see, so I just share my screen, right? You, Kathy, you, yeah. So you, where's my screen? All right. Okay, so can you see the screens now? It's on the agenda. Looks right. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Kathy, for the introduction, and for Kathy's been a huge part of our whole eThread interest group. So it's very nice to work with her on this. And what I'd like to do today is to cover some of the kind of background information about what we did with the minimal set somewhat briefly, because we have had other sessions and other community feedback on it, and then get more into the work we're now doing to really further the adoption of the minimal set of the minimal application profile. I want to acknowledge before we get started the other people on the working group who are not necessarily on the call, but definitely contributed to the work, including Maggie Hellstrom, who's on the call. Yay, Maggie. Maggie's always good to have on a call, as well as Lucia Vieira and Cosimo Vallo from Endry Fair. Also Karen Coyle, who's helped us immensely with the metadata profile template we've been using, which we'll talk about more later, and then Angus White and Elizabeth Newbold as well. So thanks to all of those folks who have helped come up with what we've got so far. So let's see, wrong direction. So as I say, what I wanted to do is just talk a little bit about what we're doing with the minimal set. That initially the idea was for the focus group that came out of discussions in that larger ETHRID interest group at a couple of plenaries ago, maybe 4 or 5 plenaries ago. There was a real interest in finding a minimal set or a core set of metadata descriptors, because people were finding that both teachers and learners were not really able to discover resources that were already existing. So there was a lot of concern about, people creating these things, but then nobody using them or not knowing they're available and kind of repeating the efforts. So we were particularly interested in discovery from people from different sectors, including both formal, meaning sort of university and higher education groups or situations, and informal as well, people who are interested in just furthering their professional education. So we were interested in that. We were interested in reducing the duplication and identifying the gaps among what was existing and what other people were thinking of creating for the service providers were thinking of creating. We wanted the set to be easily and practically adopted and implemented by learning resource creators and service providers, and that, of course, is one of the reasons it's minimal, because a couple of times we showed people at the beginning the whole set we were thinking of, and the frightened faces of the people who are contemplating either having to put that into a service provider service or creating the metadata for themselves was daunting. So we decided definitely to make it a minimal set. The work was built upon prior work that has been done by the community in the last couple of years, most especially by mapping different learning resource schemas to each other, including the Learning Resource Metadata Innovation Group, the INFRI-LOM, the EOSC Pilot Group, BioSchemas, and schema.org. And if you're familiar with any of those, then those are kind of the big ones in kind of a generic way. We also developed user stories for different perspectives, including the learners, the trainers, the service providers, the developers, and the funders, as we thought about how to reduce this large set into a minimal set that was really important for discovery. We also then compared learner perspectives, again, from those different environments, the formal, informal, and professional education, compared to other recommendations that had been made or in the process of being made for minimal sets, for fair, making sure that metadata was fair, and then gathered feedback from several different venues, including different plenary sessions, and from different stakeholders, especially service providers, who we were all even interested at that point in having people adopt the set. So the results were of these recommendations that you can see the screen that Lucia Bayer created that has the 14 properties around them, around the part shape here, that are the ones we came up with for the first draft. They are divided into categories of descriptive information. These are probably very familiar to you, that are not necessarily, special to learning resources. The access information is another category that's somewhat general, but also obviously even from the Mentimeter we just did is important for people to know. And then educational information that gave a context for that resource. So the report that we wrote includes the schema mapping we did, the background materials, including a data dictionary, the user stories, and then the snapshots of the learning application, learner application snapshots. So that DOI represents the report, and you can certainly go to that and find out more about it as you'd like. Then in terms of adoption, as I mentioned, we were very interested in having somebody use our work. If we spent 18 months or so coming up with it, with very interesting discussions. So one of the prior to the release of the report, and as part of a Fair is Fair, future implementation group work package, there was a test bed done that was, we took a number of resources and their metadata descriptors from different catalogs and put them together to see what terms were used that matched what we had come up with. And that was an interesting report, and you can find out more about that too at that link if you go to the slides and when the slides are available. But then we also decided that it was really important to do an application profile to really facilitate the adoption for different needs, because a generic learning metadata set is going to hit it'd be a very broad, higher level, but when you get down into the actual application, the implementation, then you need to be able to do more. So that's what we're talking about today. Then we also requested feedback from these other organizations that are listed here in the third bullet point, that who are considering adopting the minimal set. So in terms of creating the metadata application profile, that we saw some advantages in doing it. It really, such profiles really help explain the properties a little bit in more detail, which is especially useful for content creators and for people who are doing the cataloging or the metadata content. It also provides rules for governing the creation and reuse of the metadata so that you find out what the constraints are and what corrected usage might be to support discovery. And we'll see some examples of that when we look at some of the profiles we've got already. Then also allows us both generic profiles and then the system-specific ones, which are pretty important, I think, for understanding how you might adapt it in your own environment. And then allows views into implementations of different types of portals and registries. So it also, hopefully it will provide feedback upon, how effectively the minimal set can be used for our discovery, for our purposes of discovery and reducing duplication. So what we did was to come up with a generic profile for the minimal set as originally recommended. So the metadata structure is flat, meaning, there's one, each of the properties represent one metadata, one resource. There's no grouping of different terms together. All the properties that we came up with are required. It's the generic profile would be relatively simple and doable. The properties that are there match the minimal set, especially for people, again, who are creating content or meaning creating the resources themselves, and also any adapters of that content, and then simplicity. But the problem with simplicity is that it can be ambiguous, especially if you're trying to implement it to different systems. So the idea then was to come up with sub-profiles for the minimal set, which would allow grouping of properties that are better kept together and often repeatable as a group. And you'll see examples of what that means in a couple of contexts later. Allow more flexibility in the use of the properties. So if something's not necessarily, doesn't make sense to be required for your environment, that allow it to be recommended or optional instead. And then provide the capability to declare domain and system specific differences that can be then shared in a kind of metadata harvesting or aggregating environment. Because that was definitely one of the interests that people had, especially as different service providers had, to again reduce duplication in the metadata itself and the chances for ambiguity and confusion in that area too. So the question was how to do that, how to create a metadata application profile, especially for learning resources. And we found the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative has come up with a tabular application profile, the DC TAP template, which really look to solve or provide good way to do this for us in a relatively simple way, especially since we had already created the spreadsheets with both the mapping and the metadata terms themselves in the data dictionary. So it's fairly easy to transform it into this template. The features of the profile is that it uses a comma separated value format, so very conducive to importing from spreadsheets. It also includes elements that are important for both search and service system implementers. And again, we'll see what those are in a second. Allows for both flat and grouped properties. There's an example of that. And again, I can show you that in a minute. It's extendable. You can add terms to it. You can add elements, they call them, ways of describing the resources that you want to put in. And it's very well documented and maintained by the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative communities. And you can get the output in a number of different formats that really work for system providers, including, again, CSV, but also RDF and then JSON LD, or if your system is using that kind of thing. So if you're interested in knowing more about it, the documentation, they've got a pretty good documentation on this already, including a primer, a cookbook, and then there's a video that is a presentation on the DC TAP itself that Karen Coyle has organized. She's not here today and was not able to join us. She's the one who's kind of the group leader on that effort through DCMI. So there's a number of presentations, including that one, that you can find on their GitHub site. So this is an idea. This is an example of what not an example. This is the basic element list that the application profile uses. And I won't go into these in great detail because I think you'll see examples later on that will help explain what these mean if they're not familiar to you. The shape ID is the one that's probably the most unusual in that this is the way you do the grouping of different elements, or sorry, properties together. And then, these other elements down below, again, will show these are the core that are part of the template. This is an example of how they describe these just for this one value node type, and then the element definitions and examples are on this link as well. But you can see that the property ID is the one that links you to what other people have, when other people have used the term and described it in more detail. So this is a title, for instance. Dublin Core has a title. That's one of their main 15 elements. The node type is that it's text basically, and it's a string. So that's, again, I won't go into all of those. You can look at those in more detail later when you're interested. So as we what we did then with the minimal set in representing it as a DC TAP map, we looked at the descriptive properties, the access properties, the educational properties, and the things, the items that are, the properties that are outlined in red represent areas where we thought in our own environments it might be useful to group these together in a shape. And again, we'll show you what that means more in a bit. Then the educational properties, as we did this, if we all created the profiles, we discovered that we really needed to add another element that it was not part of the original one. And that's what's represented here with the italic starred properties below. So again, talk about that towards the end. So this is what the kind of what the generic profile looks like, chopped up so that you can see it on the slides. But the property IDs, for example, this is a schema.org name is title. It's required. It's not repeatable. It is a string. The constraints were 1,000 characters, and the type is maximal length. So this is the kind of thing that we've done for all of the elements that are there. One thing you'll note is that, and then down below, we've got allowed values, we've got definition, note, and example. So what we did in this is to add the elements of allowed values, definition, and example. That's an example of extending the template. And then we also, in the generic profile, did not have any shapes. So there's a link to these later on. You can see what all we've done. But what we did then with some generic profile, some sub profiles, were to do make some shapes. So this is one that we've done for the. I am an editor of the Data Management Training Clearinghouse, ESIP's Earth Science Information Partners Data Management Training Clearinghouse, or DMTC, and we just put in we just enhanced the clearinghouse to add some of different metadata terms, properties, but also do some grouping according to what the minimal set is. So what we thought we could do is create a shape that is basically all of the flat elements, but flat properties that would be associated with a resource. But then when it came to authors as an example, and this is not complete, we just did this with a minimal set right now, we got a distinction between personal author and organizational author. And so we wanted to break out the names into given personal family name, a given name, and maybe an identifier. So if people had orchids, that's another way to get to find out who they are, and then I'll put them all together into a full name. So all of those elements mapped together into an author, a personal author shape, so that the circles here represent the different shapes. And the other thing we've done so far is to put the two put together properties related to identifiers for the resource into a shape. So that's one example. Here's the link at the bottom to see the full profile in the TAP format if you're interested in looking at. Notice these are somewhat in draft, so that might change, but if you've got comments or questions, we'd love to hear them. The other profile we've got so far is one from the ENDRI, and I'm not going to remember the name of what that stands for. Maybe Maggie could put that in to chat. But what they're thinking of doing at this point, again, and it isn't draft yet, is to include that resource ID shape in a similar way, which they're using schema.org's ID property, but also DataCite's identifier type. And so that's one. That's in order to use these allowed values that they've got for identifier types. So this is a way of kind of describing more specifically, more clearly what they're using it for. And then they also created an author shape, but interestingly, they included other terms than we did. For instance, they included DataCite's contributor type role of author. But you can see with the example that they've got their control vocabularies have more than just author, but this satisfies the requirement for author because this is mandatory, and so that's how they're satisfying that requirement for themselves of author. And the other thing is entity. That's where you would put the name in. So it's a simpler way of putting the name in, but adding the role type, which allows them some flexibility too and later on. So again, that's an example of how a subprofile can be created to really match your particular or their particular environments. And again, that profile is available with that same spreadsheet, different tab below. So what we've learned is that the original recommendation, we think needs revision. We need to provide for clarity, better clarity on the use of persistent identifiers, partly in order to, again, reduce confusion, but also to encourage that people create citations for learning resources so that they can be reused, found more easily and better used. That was not something we considered. Citations per se, creating citations per se, just not part of what we considered in the original draft, but we think that by putting in the resource ID itself, in addition to the type of ID and the URL to the landing page, which is what we had created the URL to the landing page as part of the original recommendation and the URL type. But that didn't make a lot of sense because guess what? The URL type is a URL. So, and sometimes people, you would create a different kind of a DOI, for instance, for the citation, for the resource itself, and that would be an identifier. So the DOI, the stem of the number of the DOI would be the ID, and then the type would be DOI. So that just helps clarify what people, I think are doing to some extent, and would encourage that because you could use those for citation. So we are suggesting we add the resource ID and then change the resource URL type to resource ID type. The other thing we'd want to do, and it would be wonderful to get some feedback from you all about this as well, is create some guidance for creating maps, metadata application profiles to come up with the questions that you have to think about, in order to create a profile, including what for your purpose and so on. So we definitely would love to have more subprofiles created so that we have a way to understand how the set works, but also understand how people are really using the profile. Karen Coyle from Dublin, from the DC TAP group, has said they're contemplating the idea of a registry too, where people could kind of register when they've got subprofiles. That's still a work in progress, but that would be something we could certainly use as well. And then we also would love to have another real world experiment to test the use of the profiles for metadata sharing. So find one implementation that wants to harvest metadata from another one, or vice versa, and then test how both the profile and the minimal set itself works. So that's we'd love feedback on any or all of these things. And I think that's about all I had today. So we wanted to leave plenty of time for questions and for discussion and any kind of brainstorming. So I will stop here. Do you want me to still share the screen, Gati, or do you want to take it back?
First of all, thank you, Nancy, for the great presentation. I think for the questions, it's easier if we stop sharing the screen and we see each other if you want to ask your question directly. And if there is something to clarify, you still can show the slide. There was one question in the chat that I can ask you, Nancy, and it's a question to clarify something. Maybe you explained this, but could you clarify again, why is it shape ID? Why is the metadata ID value syntax?
Yes, okay, great. Yes, Natalie, yeah, good question. Let me share this one more time just to go back to that slide. So I think that might explain it a little bit better. So go back up here too. Okay, where they just talk about it. Right, so it's not related, I see your question had to do with whether it was related to a kind of a, you said Esri shape, so a geographic or a visual shape. It's more the question of, they use this term, as Karen explained it, in order to understand that, if you think of it from a Venn diagram point of view, that there are different elements that are part of, say, an author, like the first name, last name, the IDs, and and then those names put together that are all important to come together into a group in order so that when you display them in an environment, and different systems do this differently, as I'm sure you know. So it gives the opportunity for people to represent that grouping. So it's not so much of different points, in the sense of visually identifying, the outside perimeters and so on of a shape, but rather something that would be grouped together from kind of a semantic almost point of view, I think. So I don't know if that answers that better. I've lost the chat now, so I don't know if I got the whole question, but is that, what else did she say? Why is the value so? Not formally expressed in the schema. You mean, so Nick Jury says, so just to check, I understand, a shape is an arbitrary collection of properties that is not formally expressed in the schema. It's formally expressed, it's not formally expressed in the DC TAP schema or template, but it's an opportunity to more formally describe what you're doing in your own environment that would come together.
No, sorry, just to clarify, I was just wondering whether it's, so if it's like markup, like schema.org or something, is it expressed in the metadata itself that this is part of a shape, that this property is part of a shape that you've named author?
It would show up in your system. I mean, the way we have done it in the clearinghouse is to, as we create a document that puts elements together, properties together for a certain resource, they're within one kind of set of characteristics. So from a markdown point of view, yeah, it would be the shape itself would be repeatable throughout for different resources. And so if, for instance, if you had more than one author, you would have a shape for author number 1 and shape for author number 2, etc. So it's represented in that form in both the way you describe your metadata set, but also then it can be pulled together and displayed together in various ways in your result set for a resource.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yeah, that helps. Thanks.
Okay. Okay. All right. Reminds me a lot of mods. Name plus shape for a knowledge artifact, for example, an image. Shape for a knowledge. So, well, let's see. Okay, so I'm going to make sure I answer Petra Steiner's comment here. What reminds me a lot of mods, the metadata, descriptive scheme from Library of Congress, role for author. It's possible that that's what they were thinking of doing with the DC tab template to be influenced by the name and role as it comes from mods, but that we didn't look at any other schemas for the template, if that's what you're asking. In terms of looking at the shapes from the point of view of the minimal set, we did not think about, I mean, we talked about what else could be part of author, but you know, again, for purposes of being relatively simple and relatively minimal at a sort of mega level, we did not go into that kind of option. It certainly would make sense if part of what you're doing in a learning resource environment, I'm sorry, in the cataloging environment where you use mods, is to, you know, you could use either what mods does for those descriptive parts, but the educational elements you might want to think about grouping together into a different into a shape, since not all resources that are in a catalog are also learning resources, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. Well, my question was also, well, it reminds me of mods, for example, the part with the author where you have different roles, and this is exactly how mods deals with the problem that you have not just author or creator, but you have many ways of being a creator, like
Right.
film director or editor or
Right.
simple contributor, etc. And in the end, somehow you end always in such a kind of structure that you have something like creator plus properties. And the property is role and with certain values. And I was wondering, did you have a look when you developed your schema? Did you look at mods, or did you look at other schemas like, yeah, like mods or DCAT or BigFrame, or what was?
We did not. We did not, because we were focusing more on the educational aspects of it. So the schemas that we used in our mapping all describe in one way or another the kind of educational context. So that's why target group was important. That's why expertise level was important. That's why other terms we looked at. And you again, if you look at that schema, you can see the different terms that people used, interactivity level, that kind of thing. So all of those things, you know, are not part of mods. So we kind of left all of those descriptive terms that are more generic to people's environments. And in terms of the role plus the creator plus role context that you described, I mean, that's essentially, I think, what the Endry with the second subprofile is doing, because if you notice that, let me see if I get back to that. I'm still sharing. Again, no, yes, I am. Okay. Right, so you can see what they've done is to have a contributor type as the main property.
You're not
role.
sharing at the moment.
Oh, I'm not. Okay, sorry. I'm always assuming people can see exactly what I'm seeing. Forget to share. There we go. Better. Okay. Okay. So yeah. So what they've done is to use this role and what they call entity to do that combination. And but But as you can see, they've got the option here. And again, if Maggie, if you know something about this, or I don't know if Cosimo is on the call, who's signed up. Oh, Maggie, yes. Let me just finish my sentence, Maggie, and then I'll.
Please do.
Okay. What it looks like they have the ability to do is to choose to use that to use the role and entity for roles and entities other than author. So Maggie, you want to?
Yeah, that's exactly what we want to do. So in our current first version incarnation of our metadata model, we unfortunately did not choose to have this field repeatable. And that is very, very important, obviously. So this is then the second step in further developing this and working with this to really make reality checks all the time, because I think that is extremely important when you are both building this type of, well, metadata model, but then also to continuously check. So my already existing catalog entries, do they fit into this model? Where are the sticking points? Are there bottlenecks, etc.? And then also try to think about any future items that you want to, will be wanting to include in your catalog or repository, etc. Then again, are we lacking any fields here, or is it just that we have the fields already, but they are not set up to be repeatable, for instance, or the specification of what kind of is it a string, is it a number, etc. All of these things must be double checked and checked again. And then you can really rely on it, so to speak. But that's one of the lessons that we have learned from this, is that it's not that simple to build up a catalog from scratch that is going to hold information both about learning resources and maybe their subparts, etc.
Great. No, thanks, Maggie. Hopefully that helps, Petra. Okay, I'll stop share again then. Let's see. Then Vivek has an example of a shape for a knowledge artifact. For example, an image. Let's see. I guess in some ways, I think the same, the first profile, again, that we're using would work for an image as well as any other kind of learning resource, in the sense that if, for instance, the image that's been created has a creator. So we tried, but I mean, in terms of the image itself as a value, sorry, as an educational resource, it might be easier to think about a shaping of target audience, for instance, and linking the target audience with learning outcomes. So if the image is intended to be used as an illustration or as a figure in a exercise or something like that, then you would have the opportunity to describe in learning outcomes what that might be, assuming you describe it in a way that makes it a learning outcome, and then link it to all the common sort of descriptive information about the resource to the extent that you have it, and then a target audience. So if it's intended for the beginners, for say professional librarians who are trying to learn Python, for instance, and there's an image of how Python was used in a script or something, then you could link those two together in that way. You'd have to have set up the shape in such a way that you do that, but that's how you might use that. I don't know if that helps. Oh, and then Natalie points out there, yeah, some definite value examples in the cookbook that's part of TAP that are really helpful for that, I think, as well, including one for an ISBN, which is an identifier for a book. So, yeah, and then, okay, yeah, the control vocabulary, Petra, in the example that I showed you from Endry shows that control vocabulary. So, I hope I've answered all that are there. Good questions.
There are no questions in the question box and the collaborative notes, but do you have any other questions or comments?
If not, I have a question I'd like to ask you all. Given what you've seen so far and understanding that it's sort of it's a lot to understand at the, in just a 20-minute presentation. Would you see in your own environment, assuming you're either a content creator or a service provider or a learner yourself, would you have any interest in, from your organization or your situation, any interest in using this application profile? And if so, do you see any barriers, or what would the barriers be to using it? Be interested in any kind of comments that people have. And I think people can probably just unmute, right? So answering that question would be great. In the meantime, I can see Alex has a question, validation capability. Using RDF shapes, shackle checks to flag whether a contribution meets your minimal requirement. I think you could certainly do that if, depending on how you can export this template into JSON or RDF and then use those mechanisms to do that validation if you want to. I think that's one of the reasons that they wanted to, the DC TAP people wanted to make it available in different environments so that you could do that validation capability. But that's about what I know. There's definitely I wish Karen had been able to join. She could answer some of these questions, but there's a group that's working on this Dublin Core template all the time, and that's part of the. You can go to the GitHub location and join that group as well and ask specific questions there if you want, because I'm not an expert in the TAP. I'm learning it as well. And from what she said and what I've heard, I think it should be possible, especially because you can export those, the results of the template, the profiles into different formats. But whether they've done that and how they've done it, I'm not sure. They're also really interested in having more people work with the template as well in order to answer some of these questions in a practical way. So talk to Karen. It's a good question. All right. Subjective levels, such as subjective levels. That's what's in the there's an expertise level. Let me go back again to the question. What I wanted to go back here to the full group, full minimal set. And again, I know I'm not sharing. Yes, the subjective levels, let me share again, if that's okay. So in terms of the expertise levels, in terms of the subjective levels, I think when people intended to use expertise level for that kind of descriptive characteristic. And this again is one of the ways that there's a real opportunity for grouping expertise levels with target group, and also probably with learning outcomes. So this is, it seems to me, a natural kind of shape that you could make that would be repeatable if you wanted to, because a lot of times there could be different target groups, especially if you're reusing a resource. If you see something that looks like it'll work for you, but you want it to, make it for undergrads instead of grads, or for a different kind of task level from a professional education point of view, then you could change the resource and reuse it and sort of republish it as something that's for a different target group with different expertise, targeted to a different expertise level and to different learning outcomes. So hopefully that will answer. How would one handle learning activity with multiple learning outcomes at different levels? Aha. Okay, let's see. Well, it kind of depends on, again, I think if this is a question from Kat Halther, I think that you would have to choose how to, depending on your system, if you had one learning activity but had a shape that included different learning outcomes at different levels, you could repeat a shape and do that and have one shape to describe the activity, all within the one resource, all within one metadata record for the learning activity, which would be a resource. You would have the activity being generally described, then you would have learning outcomes associated with, again, an expertise level on a target group. That's one shape, and then you could repeat the shape with another, with different learning outcomes at different levels. The thing that is be awkward about that a little bit is the person who would know that best would be the learning creator. And a lot of times when people are creating metadata for a resource to go into a catalog, but the author has not included that kind of information, it can often only be a flat description of learning outcomes, and then you sort of guess where the target audiences are. So that's part of the idea of trying to provide sub-profiles and find out, what questions come up, what functional problems are that need to be solved from a sort of a cataloging point of view or from a content creator point of view. So it would depend on how you set that up in your system, Kat, I think. Hopefully that answers that. And then Patricia, the bioschemas profiles. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, the bioschemas profiles was very interesting, and we had the people who knew it best joined us a little bit late, but we did have definitely included the way that schema in our mapping, and had some really good discussions about that, about the differences in how we might work. So it's probably not a perfect compromise. It's not a perfect compromise with any of the schemes, I think, that we map to, but definitely bioschemas is part of that and very useful. So yeah, looking at the differences would be helpful to know more about, to get some feedback from you as well. Okay. All right, so Maggie, one thing we had, entry found, relations, which allows to add qualified references to other entities. Yes, so for instance, if an example of that might be, Maggie, a unit that's part of a course or a lesson that's part, if you got a series of lectures on a given topic, lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3 would be an example of the relationship. Is that right, Maggie? So you have
exactly, but also because what is lesson 2 in one course could be lesson 3 in another context. So if you define your smallest referenceable items, so to speak, or units in your catalog, then you have a more liberty to mix and match as you would want. And then that also addresses this learner, advanced, etc., because you can more easily put things together as a larger, more complex thing, which is illustrating the progression or the learning path of a learner through a series of different resources that you have available.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely something that'd be interesting to explore a little bit more. We had talked about after working on the minimal set, moving to an extended set that we would recommend, and whether if people are interested in that, then definitely get in touch with us, because it would take a lot of energy, but it would be, I think, really useful to do and really move along the whole evolution of how people are thinking about resources and describing them so people can find them. So I see we're getting close to the time here. I wanted to say in response to Kat's message, you would be free certainly to use any kind of just taxonomy you wanted to for the expertise level, for instance. That is not, we did not in the minimal set endorse one schema or another, I'm sorry, one control vocabulary or another. We left that up to people. We provided examples, but didn't want to recommend anything in particular because it's just too complicated to do that really. So yeah. Okay, 3 more minutes. Question about how, when, and how we can now move on. Yeah, that, well, I think, let's see, I'm gonna make sure. Oh, I just to share, and maybe I'll share this because we just got a minute left. So you can see the last slide. Oh, I'm still sharing. No wonder. Great. Yeah, the whole question about moving on to extended metadata, I think we will address a number of things on there. We could address, including learning outcomes, learning behaviors, and so on that would match more closely the Bloom's taxonomy, and also the assessment levels of assessment that are part of that. So if people are interested in that, I mean, it definitely would be worth contacting either Kati, myself, any of the groups, any of the people that are part of the subgroup, but Ethrid in general, because it's definitely something that some people are interested in. We need to know that there are more who are, and who are willing to, help take this leadership role in moving the discussion forward, because it's a complicated topic. So if you're interested in this, please let us know, because I think there are a number of us who would really like to continue it, but need kind of a cohort, a huge cohort to move us forward. So it's like that's it. Kati, do you want to close? Yeah. Okay. I'll stop talking, Kati.
You can stop talking whenever you want, but it's thank you very much. It was a very, very nice presentation and a nice discussion. Very good questions. Thank you for that. We hope to see you in our meetings in the interest group. We hope you can join and support us, or work with us together on the topics, and see you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.